December 16th, 1944. Ardennes Forest, before dawn. The trees stand rigid, black against a sky without moonlight. Snow hardens on the branches like ash. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the Germans have been awake for hours. Engines wrapped in canvas, men breathing into their gloves, officers checking watches that feel too loud in the silence. On the American side, the line is thin. A quiet sector, they called it. A place to rest divisions that had been fighting since Normandy. A place where a rifleman can almost believe the war is moving away from him. Then the night breaks. Artillery arrives first, not in a neat pattern, but as a crushing wall. Shells tear into the forest, splitting trunks, throwing frozen earth into the air. Telephone wires snap, dugouts shake. Men scramble for helmets they were using as pillows. In the sudden light of explosions, faces look older than they did yesterday. And when the barrage lifts, the dark fills with movement. Steel on roads, boots in snow, and a German offensive that expects to roll straight through. By December 1944, the war in Europe appeared, at least on Allied maps, to be approaching its final act. Paris had been liberated in August. Brussels followed in September. By autumn, American, British, and Canadian armies had driven across France at a pace that stunned even their own planners. Newspapers spoke openly of victory by Christmas. Soldiers wrote home about crossing into Germany itself. The Western Allies, for the first time since 1940, believed the enemy was breaking. But the speed of the advance carried a hidden cost. Every mile east stretched supply lines that had begun on the beaches of Normandy. Fuel trucks ran day and night. Ammunition arrived late. Food was rationed forward. Tanks sometimes reached the front with only a fraction of their fuel load. The front moved faster than logistics could follow, and by November, entire Allied corps were forced to pause, not because of German resistance, but because they had outrun their own capacity to sustain the advance. Across the lines, Germany was facing a reality far grimmer. By late 1944, the Third Reich was fighting on three collapsing fronts. In the east, the Red Army was massed along the Vistula, preparing blows that would shatter what remained of German strength. In the west, Allied armies stood along the German border. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of itself. Fuel reserves were critically low. Replacement troops were increasingly young or increasingly old. Yet Adolf Hitler refused to concede defeat. Instead, he gambled on one final offensive, an operation born not of strategic strength, but of political desperation. If Germany could strike a decisive blow in the West, Hitler believed, it could fracture the Allied coalition, force a negotiated peace, and allow Germany to concentrate against the Soviet Union. The plan was codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Its objective was audacious. German armies would punch through the Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, seize the port of Antwerp, and split the British and American forces in two. The geography was chosen deliberately. The Ardennes was rugged, forested, and poorly suited for large-scale operations, or so the Allies believed. It had been used as a German avenue of attack in 1940, but by 1944 it was considered a low-risk sector. That assumption became the plan's foundation. Hitler concentrated his best remaining mobile forces for the assault. At the northern edge stood Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, packed with elite Waffen-SS armored divisions. South of it, Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army would drive toward the Meuse. Further south, Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army would protect the flank. Together, they assembled over 200,000 men, more than 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and thousands of artillery pieces. But the offensive was built on fragile mathematics. Germany lacked the fuel to sustain a long campaign. The plan depended on capturing Allied fuel depots intact. Roads through the Ardennes were narrow and easily congested. Bridges were few. Every delay would compound the next. The timetable was unforgiving. If the advance slowed, even slightly, the entire operation risked collapse. To succeed, the Germans needed surprise. Total surprise. They achieved it. Through strict radio silence, night movements, and deceptive troop rotations, German units slipped into position without alerting Allied intelligence. Bad weather grounded Allied reconnaissance aircraft. Cloud cover and snow concealed assembly areas. By mid-December, some American commanders sensed increased enemy activity, but reports were inconsistent and often dismissed. After months of advance, the Allies had begun to believe their own momentum. The Ardennes sector was therefore manned largely by divisions recovering from heavy fighting or newly arrived units still learning the rhythms of the front. Some battalions had veterans hardened by Normandy and the Hurtgen Forest. Others were filled with replacements who had never heard an incoming shell. The sector was labeled quiet, not because it was safe, but because nothing important was expected to happen there. That expectation shaped everything: troop density, defensive depth, and readiness. When the German artillery finally opened fire before dawn on December 16th, it did not strike a fortified wall or a massed army. It struck thin American lines stretched across frozen ridges and forest roads. Lines that were never meant to absorb the full weight of Germany's last offensive. And as the snow-filled forests of the Ardennes began to echo with gunfire, the real question was no longer whether the Germans had achieved surprise, but whether these small, scattered American units could survive long enough to matter. The Ardennes does not look like a battlefield when you first study it on paper. It looks like empty space. A wide block of forest and rolling high ground, straddling Belgium and Luxembourg, cut by winding rivers, broken by ridges, stitched together by narrow roads that run from village to village like veins under skin. In summer, it is green and thick. In winter, it becomes a maze of bare trunks, snow-clogged tracks, and visibility measured in yards. In 1944, the Allies treated it as a place where the war had slowed. Not because the Germans were absent, but because the terrain itself seemed to discourage decisive action. Armored warfare demanded speed, fuel, and room to maneuver. The Ardennes offered none of those things. The roads were tight, the shoulders soft, the forests dense. A single disabled truck could jam a column for hours. A blown bridge could redirect an entire regiment. A ridgeline held by a handful of infantry could force tanks onto predictable approaches. That was the theory. But Hitler wasn't planning an elegant maneuver. He was planning a shove, an immense timed shove, designed to break through before the Allies could understand what was happening. That timetable forced German units into the very choke points the Ardennes created. Assault columns were compelled to funnel along a limited number of paved routes. The more armor committed, the worse the congestion became. Every crossroads mattered. Every village became a potential cork in the bottle. And because German fuel reserves were so strained, the offensive did not merely depend on moving fast. It depended on moving fast immediately, before idling engines and stalled columns burned away what little gasoline Germany still possessed. On the American side, the posture reflected a different kind of arithmetic. The Western Front by late 1944 stretched for hundreds of miles. Divisions were rotated and redistributed constantly. Some sectors were reinforced for major pushes. Others were held with fewer men because they were not expected to be attacked. In the Ardennes, many units were spread out in positions that would have been reasonable for patrols and minor probing attacks, but were dangerously thin against a full-scale offensive. Defensive depth was limited. Communication lines ran by field telephone that could be cut by shell fire or falling trees. Radios worked, but batteries struggled in the cold, and reception in forests and valleys could be fickle. In many places, American strongpoints were isolated by terrain, with squads and platoons anchored to roads, ridges, and villages, trusting that warning signs would come in time. The Germans were counting on those warning signs arriving too late. They also had an ally no army could command: the weather. The winter of 1944 brought low cloud ceilings, fog, and snow squalls that flattened visibility and grounded aircraft. For months, Allied air power had been a constant threat to German movement. Daylight roads could become death corridors under fighter bombers. But in the Ardennes, in mid-December, the sky closed like a lid. Reconnaissance flights were rare. Photographic, coverage was incomplete. The Air Force that normally punished German concentration was forced to wait, blind and grounded. In that weather, the German approach became almost invisible. Units assembled close to the front. Artillery was positioned and registered. Assault troops moved into the dark. Orders were delivered in person to preserve radio silence. Even some German soldiers believed the plan was impossible, but impossibility was not an obstacle when the alternative was slow defeat. When the attack came, it began with artillery designed not only to kill, but to sever the nervous system of the defense. Shells targeted command posts, telephone exchanges, road junctions, and known American positions. The aim was to paralyze coordination in the first minutes, so that small American units would fight as islands rather than as a connected front. In winter forests, that kind of isolation is not theoretical. It is physical. It is the difference between reinforcement arriving and never arriving, the difference between a retreat that can be organized and a collapse that becomes a rout. And yet the Ardennes had one feature that would matter more than almost any other: high ground. Ridges like Elsenborn Ridge on the northern sector dominated approaches and road networks. In an offensive that relied on speed, any delay around such terrain could be fatal. If the Germans could not seize the ridge lines and choke points quickly, their armored strength would be forced into narrower routes, compounding traffic, burning fuel, and placing entire columns into predictable lanes, perfect targets for artillery once the Americans could regroup and coordinate fire. So the battlefield was set by geography as much as by strategy. Germany needed surprise, speed, and momentum through forests that strangled momentum. The Allies needed time to recognize the scale of the attack, time to concentrate reserves, time for the weather to clear so aircraft could return. And between those needs stood small American units, some exhausted, some inexperienced, many scattered, holding ridges, villages, and road junctions that looked insignificant on a map, but would decide whether the German timetable lived or died. Because in the Ardennes, Little America was not a slogan. It was a reality measured in foxholes, frozen fingers, and the number of rifles that could still fire when the trees stopped shaking. In the Ardennes, the first enemy is not a man in gray-green. It is the cold. It sits in boots until toes go numb. It stiffens fingers until a rifle's metal feels like it is glued to the skin. It turns a canteen into a block of ice and makes a simple act, loading a magazine, feel slow, clumsy, impossible. By mid-December 1944, many American infantrymen in that sector were already worn down. Some had marched and fought for months. Others were new, dropped into a quiet front that looked, at first glance, like a place to learn the war gently. But winter does not allow gentle introductions. Sleep comes in fragments. A few minutes, then a flare. A few minutes, then artillery. A few minutes, then the sound of movement in the trees that might be a patrol, or might be the start of something far larger. Men become experts at reading tiny changes, a new rhythm of distant gunfire, a shape where no shape should be, a silence that feels staged. When the bombardment begins before dawn on December 16th, it does not feel like an operation. It feels like the world has turned against you. Dugouts shake. Snow falls from branches in waves. The line goes dead. No telephone, no clear orders, no certainty about who is still alive 200 yards away. In that moment, the war becomes intensely local. A squad leader's voice matters more than any distant headquarters. A single machine gun becomes a boundary between holding and being erased. And the strangest truth is this. Many of the men who will decide the next hours are not thinking about Hitler or Antwerp or the Meuse. They are thinking about the next breath they can see in the air and whether the man beside them is still there. That human scale, small, freezing, stubborn, is the beginning of how little forces start to shape a war. The Ardennes battle is often described as a clash of armies. On the ground, it is a contest for roads, not broad highways, thin, twisting routes that cut through forest and converge on villages. In winter, these roads become lifelines. They dictate where tanks can go. They dictate where supply trucks must go. They dictate where retreat is possible and where retreat becomes a trap. That means a ridgeline is never just high ground. It is a lever. A position like Elsenborn Ridge dominates approaches, overlooks key routes, and allows artillery observers to see and correct fire. If you hold it, you can force an attacker into worse ground, narrower routes, and longer delays. If you lose it, you may lose the ability to shape the battle at all. So, American defenses in this quiet sector often anchor on points that look almost too small to matter. A crossroads, a cluster of stone buildings, a bridge, a bend in the road where vehicles must slow. In that kind of fight, victory is not always a breakthrough. Sometimes victory is time. A platoon holds a village for 3 hours longer than expected. A company delays a road long enough for artillery to relocate. Engineers blow a bridge at the last moment. A handful of men with bazookas and mines force tanks to stop, reverse, and funnel into a single lane. Those hours stack like bricks. The German offensive needs speed to live. The Americans need delay to survive. Each roadblock, each stubborn stand, each small unit refusing to vanish is not simply defense. It is sabotage against the enemy timetable. And in an offensive built on precise timing, sabotage is lethal. The German soldier entering the Ardennes in December 1944 is not marching into a fantasy of easy victory. He is marching into a gamble. Many German units know the war has turned against them. They have seen the bombing. They have felt the shortages. They have watched replacements arrive younger and less trained. But they have also been told this offensive will change everything, that the Western Allies can be split, that Antwerp can be taken, that the war can be reset. The elite formations in the northern attack, especially the armored units, carry a reputation that feels like armor itself. They expect movement. They expect collapse ahead of them. They expect that a thin sector will fold quickly once hit hard enough. The first hours bring confidence. Surprise is real. American communications are cut. Forward positions are shaken. But then friction appears. A village that should fall in minutes holds for hours. A ridgeline refuses to be taken cleanly. Roads clog. Vehicles pile up. Orders become urgent. Timetables tighten. And behind the push forward, there is constant pressure because German commanders understand what the maps don't forgive. Fuel. Every delay burns fuel. Every detour burns fuel. Every stalled column is gasoline disappearing into exhaust in the middle of a forest. German tank crews can feel the clock in their engines. They know what it means if Allied reserves arrive, if the weather clears, if the offensive loses momentum before it reaches the Meuse. So when German units finally take prisoners, cold, exhausted Americans pulled from foxholes and basements, Some of those prisoners do not look like defenders of a vast front. They look like what they are: small groups, thin lines, men holding because they have nowhere else to go. And for an attacker who was told the enemy would crumble, that realization, how little stood in the way and how stubbornly it held, can land like a blow. Because it means the offensive isn't being stopped by a giant machine. It's being slowed by people. And that is a different kind of defeat, one that feels personal. The angles converge on the same truth. In the Ardennes, scale is deceptive, and the war starts to pivot on small decisions made in cold places. In December 1944, German armored power still looked terrifying at close range. Panzers moved like rolling fortresses through the trees. Panther tanks with sloped armor, assault guns low to the ground, half-tracks packed with infantry. In the narrow Ardennes roads, that steel could feel unstoppable because there was no easy room to flank it. The forest forced defenders to face the armor head-on, often at distances where the engine noise arrived before the vehicle was visible. But the Americans did not need to out-tank the Germans to stop them. They needed to make German tanks stop moving. A minefield placed on a bend in a road, a felled tree laid across a narrow passage, a bridge destroyed at the right moment, a bazooka shot taken at point-blank range into a vulnerable side angle, a well-sighted anti-tank gun firing from concealment, and, above all, artillery, the most democratic killer on a battlefield that otherwise favored heavy steel. Technology in the Ardennes became less about superior machines and more about systems surviving stress. Radios that functioned through snow and shell shock. Forward observers who could still see a ridgeline through fog. Batteries that didn't die before the message got out. Trucks that could claw their way through iced roads to deliver ammunition. Engineers who could work with numb hands, wiring explosives while shells cracked nearby. And then there was the sky. For the first days, weather locked Allied aircraft away. German columns moved with a freedom they had not felt in years. But when the clouds finally lifted, the entire technological balance threatened to flip. Roads that were safe under low ceiling became exposed. Fuel trucks and tank columns became targets. The German offensive was built to win before that happened. So every small American action that delayed movement wasn't just brave. It was technological sabotage against German mobility. A war of machines was being slowed by cold hands and simple obstacles. The Battle of the Bulge is remembered as an operation with giant arrows on a map. In reality, it often turned on men whose names never reached a headline. On the American side, the first shock of the offensive created chaos. Units were cut off. Command posts lost communication. Orders arrived late or not at all. In that vacuum, leadership did not always flow downward from a clean chain of command. It rose upward from whoever could still think clearly. A lieutenant who decides to hold a village rather than retreat, buying hours. A captain who pulls scattered men into a coherent line, turning stragglers into a fighting unit. An artillery officer who refuses to abandon his guns until they have fired their last rounds. A sergeant who keeps his squad from breaking when the forest is on fire, and the world feels larger than the human mind can handle. German leadership operated under a different pressure. The offensive demanded speed, and that pressure could become tyranny. Schedules were rigid. Routes were prescribed. Commanders were expected to move regardless of friction. But the Ardennes produced friction everywhere. Traffic jams, blown bridges, stubborn resistance, terrain that devoured momentum. When German columns slowed, the pressure intensified. Orders became harsher. Risk tolerance increased. Units were pushed forward into bottlenecks because there was no alternate route that didn't cost time, and time was the one resource Germany could not afford to spend. This is where Little America begins to matter in a strategic way. When small American units hold longer than expected, they force German commanders to make choices under stress: detour or assault, pause or push, reorganize or gamble. Those choices ripple outward, not as theory, but as fuel burned, daylight lost, and schedules shattered. Leadership in the Ardennes was less about grand speeches and more about minute-by-minute judgment in snow. And in that kind of war, local decisions can become the difference between an offensive that rolls and an offensive that stalls. There's a word that appears often in military histories: held. It sounds clean. It sounds controlled. It sounds like a line drawn with ink. In the Ardennes, held often meant something uglier. It meant men refusing to leave positions they knew could be surrounded. It meant staying in villages where roofs collapsed under shells. It meant medics working without heat, hands shaking from cold and exhaustion. It meant civilians caught in the path of armies, huddled in basements as their homes became strong points, their streets became firing lanes. For American units on that front, the moral reality was immediate. They were outnumbered, sometimes outgunned, often isolated. Retreat could mean survival, but it could also mean opening roads that German armor needed. Holding could mean death, but it could also mean saving entire sectors by forcing delays. That is the ethical weight of Little America. Because these were not always perfect defenses built for a heroic last stand. Many positions were improvised, under strength, and desperately thin. Some units were green. Some were exhausted. Many had no idea they were about to become the hinge of an entire offensive. Yet when the attack arrived, a pattern repeated across the forests and villages. Small American groups choosing resistance, not because they believed it would be glorious, but because they understood what happened if they didn't. For Germany, the moral reality was different, but still sharp. The offensive demanded speed and ruthlessness in conditions that stripped away comfort and illusion. The deeper German units pushed, the more they depended on capturing supplies, the more desperate their calculations became. War in winter compresses everyone's humanity. Hunger, cold, fear, and exhaustion make morality feel distant, until you see it in the eyes of prisoners and civilians. And sometimes, when German soldiers finally realized how few Americans had stood in their way, how thin the line truly was, the emotion wasn't only anger or disbelief. It was something closer to despair, because it meant the Reich's last gamble wasn't failing against an unstoppable force. It was failing against ordinary men in extraordinary cold, refusing to step aside. These angles are now set like overlapping camera shots: human faces, road geometry, machines, leadership under stress, and the moral cost of holding. They all point toward the same destination: the moment the German offensive collides with the places it cannot move around. The barrage begins in darkness, and for a moment, it feels infinite. German artillery strikes across the Ardennes front in a coordinated wave. Heavy guns, mortars, rockets, aimed not just to kill, but to erase the Americans' ability to understand what is happening. In the first minutes, wires are severed. Switchboards go silent. Runners step into snow-filled woods and don't return. Units that were meant to be connected become isolated pockets, each hearing the same truth in different ways. Something enormous is coming. Then the infantry moves. Assault groups push through the trees with an urgency shaped by orders and fear. They have been told the sector is thin. They have been told the Americans are unready. They have been told that surprise will do the work. In many places, those assumptions seem correct. Forward outposts are hit hard. Some positions are bypassed. Others collapse under the shock. But in the north, where the German timetable depends on opening roads toward the Meuse, the offensive does not meet emptiness. It meets ground that cannot be ignored. Villages and ridgelines, names that don't look important on a strategic map, begin to slow the advance. Lossheim Gap becomes more than a gap. It becomes a funnel. The approaches toward Elsenborn Ridge and the surrounding high ground force German units into predictable routes. In winter forests, predictability is dangerous because it turns movement into a target. On the American side, Little America becomes visible in fragments. A company here is not at full strength. A platoon there is spread too wide. Men have been rotated in and out, replacing casualties, patching holes in units that have been fighting for months. They are not arranged like a parade ground army. They are arranged like a tired front doing its best to stay intact. And yet, when the German push collides with these positions, it does not always sweep them away. American infantry holds where it can, not because it has been perfectly prepared, but because the terrain gives it moments, angles, ridges, fields of fire measured in yards. Machine guns rake the edges of forests where attackers must cross. Mortar rounds drop into road junctions. Anti-tank teams creep into positions so close they can hear the German engines idling beyond the trees. The battle begins to fracture into dozens of small fights. In one sector, a village becomes a knot of resistance. Stone buildings turned into firing positions, streets turned into channels where armor must slow. In another, a ridgeline becomes a spine that American troops refuse to surrender because they can feel what it means. If it falls, the road network behind it opens, and the German offensive gains its speed back. What the German plan requires most is not simply winning, it is winning fast. So German commanders push. Armor is brought forward through the congested roads. Units attempt to bypass resistance, then discover that bypass positions still have teeth. Still able to fire into supply lines, still able to call artillery, still able to ambush trailing vehicles. The forest does not allow clean solutions. You cannot always see what is killing you. You only feel the delay. The cold makes everything worse. Wounded men freeze. Weapons jam. Vehicles slide off roads. Recovery becomes slow. A stalled truck can block an entire column. In an offensive built on momentum, small mechanical failures become strategic problems. German columns begin to stack up behind bottlenecks. Tight turns, blown bridges, villages that refuse to clear quickly. Officers shout, redirect, improvise. The map begins to lie because it does not show the minutes slipping away. And the Americans begin to do what the Germans feared most. They begin to buy time. Time for higher headquarters to understand that this isn't a local raid. Time for reserves to be moved. Time for artillery to be massed on likely approaches. Time for defensive lines to be established on the ridges that dominate the north. Even in chaos, some American fires become frighteningly coordinated. Artillery batteries, once they regain communication, begin to drop shells into the arteries the Germans must use. In the Ardennes, you cannot simply drive around bombardment. Roads are limited. Forests are thick. Snow makes off-road movement risky or impossible for heavy vehicles. When the Americans find the routes, they can turn them into slaughter zones. From the German perspective, the first day begins to feel wrong. Not because the offensive has failed. Far from it. German forces penetrate deeply in some sectors. American units are overrun in places. Prisoners are taken. Equipment is abandoned. The front is bent into a bulge that will give the battle its name. But the northern timetable, where elite armored formations are meant to punch through quickly, begins to grind. It grinds against ridges, against narrow roads, against stubborn pockets of resistance that seem too small to cause such problems. And somewhere behind the forward German spearheads, the first prisoners begin to move under guard, Americans shivering, dazed, dirty with snow and earth. Some German soldiers glance at them and see not the defenders of a massive Allied front, but tired infantrymen in thin positions. It is an early hint of the truth the offensive will keep revealing. The line they are fighting through is not thick, it is fragile, and that makes every hour of delay feel even more unforgivable. Because if Germany cannot break through quickly against such thin resistance, if it cannot shatter little America at the start, then the offensive is not simply slowed. It is bleeding out, minute by minute, into the snow. And as the first day closes, the battle's turning point begins to form, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a creeping realization that the German timetable is already slipping. Night returns to the Ardennes the way it always does in winter, fast, heavy, without ceremony. But now the darkness carries a new sound, engines idling too long, tracks grinding in place, vehicles stopping and starting in short, frustrated bursts, columns packed tight on narrow roads, nose to tail, their breath turned into exhaust that hangs low among the trees. The German offensive is still moving forward in places, but it is no longer moving cleanly. It is beginning to choke on the very ground it chose. In the north, the ridges and villages that dominate the road network become a hard reality. German armored formations, built for open maneuver, are forced into constricted approaches where a small defense can have outsized impact. A roadblock doesn't need to destroy a column. It only needs to stop it. Once stopped, everything behind it stops too. The Ardennes is not a battlefield of sweeping flanks. It is a battlefield of bottlenecks. And the Americans, battered as they are, start to understand what the Germans are trying to do. Not in the abstract, in the practical. They see where the roads go. They see which bridges matter. They see that the enemy needs speed more than it needs elegance. That insight is a weapon. It shapes every decision. Where to hold, where to fall back, where to turn a village into a trap rather than a grave. Small units become hinges. A platoon holds a crossroads just long enough for engineers to prepare demolitions. A company stays on a ridge until the last safe minute, then withdraws under fire, leaving behind mines and wrecked vehicles that force armor to slow. Artillery observers, cold, exhausted, stay in exposed positions because if they can still see the road, they can still call fire. And if they can still call fire, they can still turn German momentum into German delay. By the second day, the German schedule is no longer a schedule. It's a hope. Because every hour that passes allows the Allies to react. Reserves are shifted. Commanders begin to form a clearer picture of the offensive size. Defensive positions deepen. And while the sky remains hostile, the Americans know what will happen when it changes. Because it always changes. Fog does not last forever. Clouds do not last forever. The German attack is racing a weather front. It is racing fuel. It is racing time itself. And then gradually, the offensive begins to reveal a cruel irony. The Germans are not being stopped by a massive wall. They are being slowed by fragments, by tired divisions spread thin, by understrength companies holding villages longer than they should, by artillery and terrain working together like jaws. The resistance feels inconsistent, fierce in some places, collapsing in others, but even inconsistency can be fatal when your plan depends on synchronized speed. This is the moment where the documentary lens tightens, not on headquarters maps, not on grand arrows, on the prisoner columns. German soldiers begin to collect American captives from overrun outposts, shattered villages, and pockets that ran out of ammunition or were surrounded. The prisoners are not polished troops marching in formation. They are men with frost on their helmets and mud on their faces. Some are shaking from cold. Some are staring straight ahead as if the mind has retreated somewhere safer. Their uniforms are worn. Their numbers, when seen up close, are not impressive. And that is where the truth begins to land. Because the German myth of the Ardennes sector, what they were told was that it was thin and weak, yes, but also that thinness would mean collapse, that weakness would mean speed, that a shock blow would produce a clean rupture. Instead, thinness produces something else. It produces stubbornness. It produces small groups that, once cut off, have nothing to do but fight where they stand. It produces resistance that doesn't look organized from above, but is vicious on the ground. Because in many places, those Americans aren't defending a grand plan. They're defending the only line they can still understand: a ridge, a road, a village, a patch of forest. And for some German soldiers, seeing that up close, seeing that this offensive is being bled by men who are exhausted, outnumbered, sometimes half-trained, hits with a kind of emotional violence. Not because the Americans are pitiful, because their smallness makes the German failure feel unbearable. If the Reich's last gamble cannot break through this quickly, if it cannot crush these scattered defenders before the Allies recover, then what does that say about Germany's remaining strength? The offensive becomes a machine that is still moving but now overheating. Fuel shortages grow sharper. Vehicles are abandoned when gasoline runs out. Columns stall longer. Detours multiply. Each detour burns more fuel. Each stalled hour makes the weather more likely to clear. And when it does, when the clouds lift and Allied aircraft begin to return, the German advantage collapses in broad daylight. The roads become exposed. Tanks and trucks become targets. Supply lines become fragile. The German offensive, designed to split the Allies, begins instead to compress into narrower and narrower routes, making itself easier to hit. And that is the turning point. Not a single shot, not a single speech, a timetable breaking under pressure, a plan that needed perfection. Discovering the real world is made of friction. And in that friction, snow, ridges, small villages, tired American rifle companies, Germany's last great offensive begins to lose its breath. Because it is one thing to be stopped by a vast army. It is another thing to be stopped, day after day, by the truth that little America was never supposed to hold at all. And once the German spearheads lose momentum, the consequences spread outward, across the front, across the command decisions, across the lives caught in the forests, until the battle is no longer about surprise and breakthrough. It becomes about survival, cost, and what remains after the gamble fails. When the German offensive loses its momentum, it does not stop like a car. It slows like a body bleeding out in the snow, gradually, unevenly, stubbornly. In some places, German units still push forward. In others, they dig in, trying to hold what they've taken. The front becomes jagged, confusing, and violent, with American and German forces interlocked across forests and shattered villages. But the central German requirement, speed toward the Meuse, speed toward Antwerp, has been damaged in a way that cannot be repaired with courage or orders. The northern shoulder remains the key. Where the Germans needed clean access through the road network, the stubborn defense on high ground and at choke points has done its job. Holding ridges and road junctions doesn't always look heroic from a distance because it often produces no dramatic advance. It produces something quieter, the enemy failing to arrive where he planned to arrive. That failure changes everything. American command begins to stabilize the front. Units that were scattered are reorganized. Stragglers are pulled into provisional formations. Artillery is massed and coordinated more effectively. And once weather conditions allow, Allied air power returns as a punishing multiplier, attacking exposed German movements, supply columns, and fuel trucks that cannot hide forever on open roads. For the American infantrymen who held those first days, this shift does not feel like victory. It feels like exhaustion finally turning into permission to breathe. Because the price of holding is written in bodies and burnt villages. The Ardennes offensive tears through towns that had lived under the illusion of being far from the war. Houses become defensive positions, then become rubble. Churches and schoolhouses become landmarks for artillery observers, then become shells of stone. Civilians huddle in basements, hearing languages above them, sometimes German, sometimes English, often only the blunt grammar of explosions. Medical stations overflow. Frostbite joins shrapnel as a constant injury. The cold is not background. It is an active force that increases suffering and reduces endurance. Men who survive firefights still collapse from fatigue. Supply problems don't vanish just because the strategic picture improves. Ammunition must still be carried. Food must still arrive. Wounded must still be evacuated along roads that are slick, blocked, and under threat. German losses accumulate too, and for Germany, loss has a different meaning in late 1944. An American division can replace men and rebuild strength over time. Germany increasingly cannot. Tanks destroyed in the Ardennes are not easily replaced. Fuel burned in stalled columns is not recovered. Veteran crews killed or captured are not replaced by training that no longer exists at full scale. Every day the offensive fails to achieve its goal is not merely a day wasted. It is a day spent consuming resources Germany cannot afford to spend. This is why those early delays matter so much. They force Germany to fight the battle it cannot win, a prolonged struggle against an enemy whose reserves, manpower, fuel, artillery ammunition, air, power are deeper. In the weeks that follow, the Bulge becomes a grinding contest of attrition. The Allies press back. The Germans try to hold, then to withdraw. The battle swings through forests and villages, already ruined once, and then ruined again. What began as a lightning gamble becomes a brutal winter fight, whose results are measured not in kilometers gained, but in how much strength Germany bleeds away in exchange for nothing it can keep. And for the men who were there at the beginning, the scattered rifle companies, the thin lines, the improvised defenses, the aftermath carries a quiet truth. They were not supposed to stop an offensive like this. They were supposed to be brushed aside. Yet the ground they held, ridges, roads, villages, helped break the German timetable. And once that timetable broke, the offensive was no longer a blade. It was a weight Germany could not carry. And as German units began to pull back or surrender in growing numbers, another consequence emerged. One that would be seen not on maps, but in prisoner cages and aid stations. The emotional collapse that can come when soldiers realize what they have spent their last strength against. As the Bulge begins to shrink, the war changes its texture. It becomes less about surprise and more about arithmetic. Roads, fuel, ammunition, reserves. Germany's offensive had been designed as a short, violent thrust through the Ardennes, launched 16 December 1944, meant to rupture Allied lines and drive toward Antwerp to split Allied forces. But a plan like that has a built-in weakness. It cannot tolerate delay. On the northern shoulder, around places like Elsenborn Ridge, Krinkelt-Rocherath, and the road network feeding west, American defenses do something strategically decisive without always looking dramatic in the moment. They hold key ground long enough to deny the Germans the road control they needed to keep their advance supplied and synchronized. The Ridge Fight, stretching through late December, becomes one of the anchors that helps prevent 6th Panzer Army from getting the freedom of movement it required. And with that, the German offensive begins to hollow out from the inside. The deeper German units push, the more they depend on fragile supply lines running along a handful of snowbound routes. Traffic jams become operational crises. Engineer delays at damaged crossings create bottlenecks that radiate backward for miles. Fuel becomes the silent dictator of what can be attempted and what must be abandoned, a constraint German planners understood from the start, because the offensive's success depended heavily on seizing Allied supply stocks to keep armored formations moving. When the weather finally lifts, the battlefield punishes those bottlenecks. Allied aircraft, grounded for crucial early days by fog and low cloud, return to the sky and begin striking exposed movement and supply. The German offensive, already slowed by terrain and resistance, now finds itself fighting under a condition it was meant to avoid: daylight visibility and air attack, with fuel and time already slipping away. This is where the story's truth lands, not as a slogan, but as a human reaction that can be seen in captivity. As more German soldiers are taken prisoner, the atmosphere among them shifts from confidence to disbelief and exhaustion. Some captives, confronted with the scale of what they failed to achieve, show the emotional collapse that comes when a soldier realizes the gamble is over. The offensive did not fail because the enemy was absent. It failed because the enemy, often thinly spread and battered, held long enough for the weight of Allied reserves to arrive. It's important to be precise here. Not every prisoner cried. Not every prisoner reacted the same way. War produces every kind of response: rage, silence, numbness, shame, relief. But what is historically consistent about the Ardennes is that Germany's offensive was an all-in attempt, and once it stalled, the consequences were irreversible. The battle's outcome drained Germany's remaining strength at a moment when it could least afford losses, while the Allies, though bloodied, could replace men, fuel, and equipment. By the time the front stabilizes again, the Ardennes has become a graveyard of burned vehicles and broken villages. Evidence not just of combat, but of a strategic failure that consumed what Germany could not replace. And in that wreckage, the meaning of Little America becomes clearer. It wasn't about a single heroic pose, but about thin lines holding long enough to break a timetable. Because once the timetable broke, the offensive stopped being a blade aimed at Antwerp. It became a wound that bled Germany dry. And when a war reaches that stage, when men surrender not simply because they are surrounded, but because the purpose is gone, the story naturally turns toward the quiet question that follows every winter battle. What did it mean for the soldiers who held, for the soldiers who attacked, and for the history that came after? When the guns finally thin out in the Ardennes, the forest doesn't look like a battlefield the way people imagine one. It looks like weather has passed through and taken something with it. Trees are split open and blackened. Snow is churned into mud and frozen again. Roads are scarred with track marks and the dark shapes of vehicles that will never move. In the villages, the walls that still stand are pocked and hollow, as if the buildings themselves have been listening to artillery for days and no longer remember what silence is. The Battle of the Bulge is often remembered for its size, for the bulge on the map, for the scale of armor and men, for the panic it caused, and the relief that followed. But its deeper lesson lives in the smaller measurements. It lives in the distance a messenger runs when radios fail, in the number of rounds left in a machine gun belt, in a ridge held because someone understood that a road behind it was a lifeline, not a line on paper, in the way time becomes a weapon when you do not have enough steel, enough sleep, enough men. That is what Little America really means. Not that the defenders were weak, but that the defense was thin enough to make every minute of resistance feel impossible, and therefore strategically priceless. Germany's gamble depended on speed and shock. It required the world to behave like a plan. But winter war is made of friction, frozen roads, jammed columns, confusion in the trees, and stubborn positions that refuse to disappear on schedule. And once that schedule breaks, the offensive becomes something else, not a spear, a burden. For the soldiers on both sides, the truth of it is quieter than the headlines. Most of them never see Antwerp. Most of them never touch the grand objectives. They fight for a bend in a road, a village name they can't pronounce, a patch of forest that smells like smoke and pine sap and cordite. History sometimes turns on great inventions and famous leaders, and sometimes it turns on tired men in the cold, holding a line that was never supposed to hold, long enough for everything else to change.